All right, everybody. Welcome to tonight's CWD Live broadcast here on Facebook. We appreciate everybody tuning in tonight. It's going to be a good conversation. We're going to be talking CWD, and we're gonna cover the new incentive that we're offering and discuss why we're offering that and some of the details about that, why it's a good thing. And we've also got a special guest with us, Mr. Doug Duren. He is he's a conservationist, a passionate hunter, a farmer, land manager, but he's also been a contributor to Meat Eater. He's been on that show. He's frequented that show, also their podcast. So it's going to be fun to have him with us tonight and get his perspective on CWD and why it's important to harvest deer in those units. And it's going to be fun. But I want to introduce or let the folks on the panel introduce themselves tonight. You've seen a lot of them before, but we're going to talk with them again tonight. So once again, thanks for being with us. And I'm going to start top left of the screen there with Mr. Michael Parsley. Mike, will you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Mike Parsley. I'm the Assistant Chief of Outreach and Communications at TWRA. I'm more of a regular hunter, being that I just took this job a year ago, and all of it's pretty new to me. So I'm going to be one of those people that just ask the everyday questions that our hunters want asked. I also, for TWRA, I'm the R3 coordinator, which really means I try to get out there and get more people hunting and fishing. And if they don't know how to do it, I try and teach it. So I've got a pretty good job, and TWRA is a great place to work, and they have great information. We just need to listen to them, and that's what we're here to do.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Dan, you care to introduce yourself, please?
I'm Dan Grove. I'm the UT Extension Wildlife Health Specialist, and I serve as the wildlife veterinarian for TWRA.
Thank you, Dan. Miss Stephanie.
Hi, everybody. I'm Steph Durno-Carnes. I'm a wildlife biologist for TWRA. I've been working with chronic wasting disease since the year 2000. I started off as an officer and a biologist for Colorado, and I'm a recent transplant to Tennessee and a new addition to TWRA. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to be talking with y'all tonight.
We're glad to have you, Stephanie. Chuck, you're next. I know you are happy to have Stephanie on the team, but go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, you've covered all the talent, but this is Chuck Yost, and I'm the Wildlife Species Program Manager for TWRA. Been involved with CWD ever since we discovered it in 2018, and just glad to be here and appreciate everybody joining in to learn more about this issue. Thank you.
And last but not least, Mr. Doug Duren, thank you for being with us again tonight, but go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Doug Duren from Cazenovia, Wisconsin, southwest Wisconsin, Richland County, right in the Driftless area and right in the CWD area in Wisconsin. Here to talk about my experience and my perspective. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Mike, do you want to get us kicked off with some of the first questions and get the discussion rolling?
I guess the first point being, Doug, you've logged a lot of hours on this subject, and we wanted to get your opinion on CWD and how it started off in Wisconsin and what was attempted up there, and where it went from when it first was noticed in Wisconsin and where it is now. What, in a nutshell, what do you think happened at the very beginning, and did something go wrong, and where are you now? I know it's a large question, but in a nutshell, what's happened up there?
Well, as you folks all probably know, it was discovered in Wisconsin in 2002, and as most of you folks could probably tell folks that it was probably present in the state for some time before that. A couple of deer were found sick, and about 60 miles to the south of me. Since that time, it has spread. Now, it's north of our area, so more than 60 miles. as far as 80 miles north from our hot area. And prevalence has increased south of me about 20 miles. It's pretty much a coin flip with bucks at this, with mature bucks at this point, 50% in mature bucks, about 35% in does. And that's the scary part for us. Being on the northern edge of it, we've had a handful of positives on our farm. We get every deer tested, but there's been an increase in the spread and the increase in the prevalence. Anecdotally, I can tell you that I get a lot of people reach out to me for a couple of different reasons. One is I have both a self-service kiosk on my property and a dumpster there for proper disposal of carcasses. And then also because of my work with Meat Eater and some of the work that I've been involved with. But folks reach out to me about it, and a couple of years ago, it was, we had 3 out of 8 deer test positive. This year, I've been contacted by people in the Spring Green area, which is just across the river. It's about 30 miles to the south of us. 8 of 8 bucks testing positive. Fawns testing positive. And with a disease that is going to kill that deer in 2 years, a positive fawn doesn't bode well for the long term. So we still have plenty of deer. I'm on the County Deer Advisory Council for Richland County, and we still have plenty of deer in our county, but we're combating the population, the high population areas. There's a big increase in prevalence in those areas. So we're really working at controlling population, or wanting to control population, so that we can have a healthy deer herd. A good number of deer, but at the same time, because we have pretty high populations, not as high as what I've heard that you have in some of these areas, but we're at about 75 deer per square mile. And those populations are pretty concentrated in some areas, and that's where our biggest disease areas are. It only makes sense, right? The more crowded together the animals are, the more there are in an area, the faster the disease is going to spread. So we're working. What we would like to do is to do a better job of managing our population and still having a healthy deer herd.
Dan, Doug brought up a pretty good point that they've got a large population still up in Wisconsin, although they're getting a large percentage of prevalence in their herd. To that point, we've had questions down here from Facebook and just comments to us at the TWRA that says, if it's so prevalent in Tennessee in the CWD zone, why are we not finding piles of dead deer?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a common misconception, and it was even kind of the same way in Wisconsin in the beginning. I was up there actually in 2003 working on a research project down in Dane and Iowa counties, which is kind of like where the heart of CWD is in Wisconsin. And the reality is we're used to seeing die-offs here in the South, at least, and some, in other places throughout the U.S. from hemorrhagic disease, different disease caused by a virus, but you see a bunch of dead deer all at once. Problem with CWD is you don't all get infected at the same time. And there's a variability from anywhere from 10 to 18 months before you actually show clinical signs when you get infected with the disease. So you might be the 10-month or you might be the 18-month, and so if you're infected at the same time as, another buck that you were with, you might die at different points in time, and so you're not seeing a bunch of dead animals all at once. One thing, though, that people are starting to see, not necessarily here in Tennessee, but other areas where the disease has been for a long time, is you're actually seeing a shift in the age structure. You don't see old age class bucks on the landscape, or even does for that matter. Even some of the data out of Wisconsin that's available on their website, you can see over time that there's a higher and higher prevalence in the older age class animals. Basically, just the fact that you're on the landscape for any length of time, you're going to get the disease and you're going to die from it. In our first year of detection, we actually had positives in fawns when we first found the disease in our first year of detection. And as Doug mentioned, that's not a good sign. For one thing, it means it's been on the landscape for a while and it's within the doe family units at this point in time, and not just kind of our bucks that might be wandering across the landscape. It's in every age and sex class that we have, and we've had identified positives out of each age and sex class here in the state of Tennessee. And in many ways, we're already in some of our areas at the same prevalences that they're seeing in Wisconsin. Same thing as in Arkansas, where they've got high prevalences in their endemic area. So we're really, already about 20 years down the road, probably, from when we first actually had the disease introduced. And so, because we just found it, we don't have that long-term data set to help us identify if there has been a shift in the age structure. And the thing is when you have good quality habitat and you have a lot of deer on the landscape, your population won't start to crash because you can suffer a loss of X number of animals before you actually see a population decline. Now, if you look in populations out west that it's not as good a quality habitat and there's a lot less deer on the landscape to begin with, they are seeing declines in their animals. And so whenever you start to reach those higher prevalences, you have to reach that above 50% prevalence before you actually might start to be able to detect a decline in the population. In some of our areas, we're 75 to over 100 deer per square mile in some of our areas. And so we might not pick up on a population decline, but we will start seeing younger and younger age class animals through our harvest data. And there's potential that already is occurring. It's just we need more data because this is our third year of intensive data collection. And really you need, 4 or 5 or even longer years worth of data before you can start picking up on some of these changes.
All right. And Dan or Stephanie or Chuck, out west in the mule deer population, we have seen what happens when it does tip over the 50% prevalent threshold in a herd, right? What happens when that number is reached?
So
actually, out west, they started seeing impacts at a much lower prevalence because they have the habitat's not the same quality and they have less deer in the landscape. So, those two things, it takes lower prevalence for that to actually occur. So they actually started seeing changes in the population at about 20% prevalence.
Another argument that we've seen from some of our hunters in Tennessee is they argue, well, it's always been here. And if it's always been here, it can't be that serious because it's not wiped out the herd yet. What about that argument? Have you heard that yourself?
I hadn't heard it here in Tennessee, but I've worked in a lot of states with CWD, and I have heard that sentiment a lot. I guess the reality is after Wisconsin actually found it in 2002, there was federal money made available, and all the lower 48 states did some level of intensive surveillance for a couple years because there was money available. And it just hasn't been found in other states. Some of that's dwindled off in terms of how much people are doing testing relative to where it's found in the U.S. But this disease clearly, based on the pattern of spread, has been assisted by a man-made movement, whether it be live or dead animal. And it's obviously out west, it had its own natural progression of disease across the landscape, and just the way it's progressed through Colorado and then across over to Kansas and Nebraska and into Wyoming and just kind of out from where it was first discovered, that gives you the idea of how long it takes for the disease to actually spread from population to population. And that's been about 60 years. So it's not always been here. Every indication is that this was a point source introduction at some point in time or a crossover event from another related prion disease.
Mike, I've got some more I could add to that, but I noticed Mr. Durian had a comment. I'm going to give him an opportunity to inject before I say anything else.
Just all I would say very quickly was when it was talking about the age structure, and I'd just like to say that in Wisconsin and in our area and the folks that I speak with, the anecdotal evidence follows that data that that people are not seeing in higher prevalence areas, just simply aren't seeing older deer. Some will say, well, it's because of overharvest. It's not because of overharvest. They're finding older deer, but they're finding them dead, or they're just not getting to that age. but we haven't had a population crash as of yet. But it's important, I think, to point out that we're finding that the anecdotal, the stories folks are telling me is very similar to what the data is showing that he was just talking about.
Yeah, and I'll add to that one of the things that stood out to me about our experience with CWD in Tennessee is it's obvious that it's been in the state, and unfortunately it was there for quite some time before we detected it. And now that we've done intensive sampling or monitoring, we've determined that it exists at a high prevalence in Fayette and Hardeman counties. And the Fayette County wildlife officer, Ty Inman, who's been down there forever and well respected and really in touch with the deer population and the hunting community there, he shared with me an observation that over the last decade, he's noticed a significant decline in the number of older bucks that hunters have asked him to score because they were trophies. And I thought that was pretty significant. It's anecdotal, but it's coming from a great source, a long-term source, and an observation that chances are that there is a age structure impact already in those high prevalence counties. Another thing that we might anticipate if prevalence continues to increase and maybe get to the level like Mr. Duren is experiencing in Wisconsin is that we could just have less deer overall, which I always try to think, well, how does that equate to hunting? Well, what it means is that there'll be, you'll see less deer while hunting. So we don't want that to happen. So we're doing the best we can to try to keep that prevalence from increasing. And there was one other point I was going to make there, but I'll come back to it. So, the last point is if you harvest a deer, if prevalence increases, then each time you harvest a deer, it's more likely that deer is going to be positive for CWD. So that's another consequence of prevalence increasing is that if you're lucky enough to harvest a deer, that it could increase the chance of being positive, which is unfortunate, and something else we'd like to prevent is keeping that percentage low.
So to that point, Chuck, we get asked, and we just got asked on Facebook, why don't we just let nature run its course? Why don't we let this go through the herd and run its course? It doesn't run its course, does it? It just stays, right?
Well, I'll let Dan back me up, but it's pretty much the things I just described. If we let it run its course, then prevalence is going to go up, and age structure is going to come down. Deer population is eventually going to come down, and then the chances of harvesting a non-positive deer is going to be slim.
Dan, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, they've looked at using huge data sets from the states that have had the disease for a long time, and they, left unchecked, some predictive models have shown within 50 to 70 years that the deer population will be extinct in some areas that have high prevalences of CWD. And granted, that's going to be longer than any of our lifetimes, as we're talking about this. And we as wildlife managers, we don't manage for next year's population. The deer that are on the landscape, the management actions taken to get those there today that we're actually in an active hunting season right now, those management actions were taken 20 years ago. And so we need to do something now so that 20 years from now, we actually have a deer population. We don't want to wait and find out, hey, we should have done something, because we know this disease lasts on the landscape. It's environmentally stable. And so the further we let it spread in the environment, the harder it's going to be to actually do something later on if we find out, hey, we should have been doing something this whole time. And so it just kind of builds and builds on itself. If it was kind of like hemorrhagic disease where it ebbs and flows and cycles based on the midge life cycle that spreads that particular disease, that's one thing, because that will ebb and flow and the population will rebound. But every time that an animal's out there with CWD, it's putting more of those prions into the environment, and you're basically just creating an environmental prion load that will be there indefinitely. And so every animal, even if all the animals die off, any animal that comes into that area will then have a high chance of being infected just by being in the environment, whether there's any infected animals left or not.
And that brings up another good point, Doug. And it's about land, right? It stays on the landscape. It's just not in the animals. It stays in the land, correct?
That was for me?
Yes.
Yes, that is my understanding. And in Wisconsin, one of the things that we've done is it's illegal to now use bait, mineral, salt licks, that kind of stuff in areas, ironically enough, that you can still go to the local sporting goods store or hardware store or farm store and still buy bait and that sort of stuff. And I guess people are supposed to be taking that where it's legal. But it's one of those conundrums that we have. Something I've talked to some stores about. But yeah, there it is in the landscape. And what we're trying to do, of course, is to remove as much infectious material from the landscape as we can. And that's what our dumpster program is about, which has been, fairly successful, but it's pretty low-hanging fruit, as my friend Brian Richards would say. It's, it's just sort of basic hygiene that we are, trying to do in these concentrated areas.
Doug, these arguments that I brought up to Dan and Stephanie and Chuck that have been made to us, are they the same arguments you heard when Wisconsin tried to tackle this issue?
Yeah, it's hauntingly familiar, as the song says, right? Yeah, very, very, very much so. Let's let nature run its course. Well, nature's course is pretty much unknown. Another one is that, it hasn't transferred to humans, so what's the big deal? And, to me, what I find interesting about that is the effect that doesn't have any regard for the effect on the resource. I have some animal rights folks and friends, that I speak with about this, and I said to them, I think it's important you folks get behind these efforts. And we're not hunters. And it's like, yeah, but you're animal rights people. What this disease does to deer, the individual deer, is horrific. I've seen it. I've seen deer dispatched that have the disease. It's horrific to watch a deer die go through that clinical stage of CWD. So animal rights people should be concerned about it. People who are concerned about public health should be concerned about it. Who wants a bunch of diseased animals on the landscape that, of course, at this time, as we all know, there's no evidence that it's transferred to humans yet. My meat-eating friends, the same. Is this? You see a deer that has chronic wasting disease and is in the clinical stages. Well, the one I shot had it, but he looked perfectly healthy. Right. Well, but would you eat that deer that was in the clinical stage? That becomes a question, even though it hasn't. So we want a healthy resource. And then to Dan's point before, when you have an age structure that's getting younger, trophy hunters should be concerned about chronic wasting disease as well, because it does affect that. I want to say, again, anecdotally, a fellow that I spoke with 3 years ago, who is now using the kiosk and said, he wasn't that particularly concerned about it, admitted to me the other day that he says, I'm not seeing older deer. His place is about 10 miles south of me. He says, I'm not seeing older deer in my property. I think it's CWD. And I'm like, well, there could be a lot of reasons for it. But man, he went from a non-believer to a believer almost overnight because suddenly he's not seeing older deer. And of course, I'm thinking, well, there could be other reasons for it as well. That, we need to look at this rationally and logically and scientifically like you folks do. But that's concerning. So, I just can't see a segment of the population that shouldn't be concerned about chronic wasting disease.
What did Wisconsin do when they first saw this? What tool did they try to employ to cut down on the prevalence?
Well, they used a term that I think that made a lot of folks cringe, and that was eradication. And, 20 years ago, what we knew about chronic wasting disease in a place like Wisconsin, very different than what we know about it now. We know that we have to manage this disease. I mean, I break stuff down to bumper stickers, right? If you don't have it, you don't want it. And if you do have it, you want as little as possible. So they went into this eradication mode because they thought that it was localized enough that they could control it. Now, I can tell you, as a farm kid who's hunted his whole life, if somebody would have come to me 20 years ago and say, we have to kill every deer on your farm and every deer on all the farms around you, I'd have probably said, well, can we talk about this a little bit more? I'd like to learn a little bit more about it so I can understand why people in that area might have, pushed back against it. I know they got a certain level of cooperation. I was in the management zone immediately, and our hunting opportunities increased. And when I mean hunting opportunities, I mean gun hunting opportunities. I mean, we have to admit that we manage deer with rifles. We don't, or shotguns. I don't know what you guys use down there, but if we go out to kill deer, we kill a lot of them with rifles. So they did, they opened up a lot more seasons and a lot more opportunity. And that was 2003, 2004, 2005. And I think that funding got cut in about 2005, and we were using tools like Ernebuck. And then there was political pressure put on by a small but very vocal group in Wisconsin. And in 2011, the biggest tool that we had for controlling population, Ernebuck, was taken away. And you can look at the prevalence charts and the maps from 2011 to now, and there has been an explosion both in prevalence and the quickening of the spread. The one thing that hasn't happened that was predicted is that we were going to have a deer herd crash. Well, we haven't gotten to that point in prevalence yet, and we are so good, sounds like you folks are down there. We have great habitat, man-made, manipulated habitat. We have this groceries for them, and so we're replacing deer very, very quickly. So we haven't had that population crash, but we have had that age structure crash. Anyway, in 2011, Ernebuck, because of political pressure, was taken away, and we've seen a dramatic increase in the last 9 years. We simply aren't using the tool, but I want to stress this. I read on some of the Facebook comments that people said, it didn't work in Wisconsin. Why are we trying to do it? It didn't work in Wisconsin because we didn't follow through. We didn't stick with it. That political pressure, not science, political pressure and social pressure and all of that was a part of it. And we had a deer trustee come in from out of state that was hired by the governor, and all those things happened. It wasn't because it failed. It was because it wasn't given time.
Stephanie, what tools is the state of Tennessee using to cut down on the prevalence? Are we doing what Wisconsin did, or what are we doing specifically here in Tennessee?
So our greatest partners are the hunters, and we're working to decrease densities by increasing harvest. Just like any kind of concentrated population, disease spreads best in concentrated, densely populated areas. And so our first tool is decreasing the densities of the deer in the affected area through hunter harvest. That's our main goal, is to work with hunters. We have some other tools that are coming along this year to both increase harvest and also to develop some other strategies on how we're going to decrease densities in the areas of the newest affected areas. So I'll just pause right there. Was that the question you were looking to answer? Because I can keep talking, but I want to make sure I answered your question.
But no, you did. But specifically, we've allowed people in the CWD zone to use rifles during the velvet hunt, right?
Absolutely.
And we've come out with a new incentive program that says that you can get a free sportsman's license the following year if you take 4 dove and 4 bucks in the CWD zone, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Has the season been? It's been extended at the end of the year as well, right?
So we aren't increasing harvest after the end of the season, but the strategies that you've mentioned have been incredibly successful. We increased harvest by almost 150% during that velvet hunt. So we have increased harvest, and that is directly because hunters have been participating in helping manage the disease. And unfortunately, right now, we're not managing the deer herd specifically. We have to manage the disease. We have to manage the spread of the disease, and we have to manage the prevalence in the affected area. So we have been successful in working with hunters to increase harvest, exactly with the tools that you just talked about. In addition to that, we will be doing targeted removal at the end of the season. And that is a program working with partner landowners, only with landowners who give us permission. We'll be contracting with USDA's Wildlife Services to decrease deer densities in four spark areas, is what we're calling them. And those spark areas are newly positive deer more than 10 miles from the other closest positive. And those 4 locations are in the north and east extent of the known affected area. And those areas will be using targeted removal this winter after the hunting season, after hunters have had their opportunity to help manage the disease. We'll be using targeted removal to reduce deer densities in those newly affected areas to try and get an idea of how prevalent the disease is in the area, what the extent of it is, and then also to try and get an idea of how best we can manage the disease in the area. Hopefully, we will decrease the density of deer in the area, decrease the prevalence, and also understand the extent of the disease. So we'll be doing that, working with partner landowners this winter and very early spring, and hopefully have a better idea of what our next steps will be. But that'll be starting this winter.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Mike, I'd like to share about Tennessee program versus Wisconsin. There's a couple of things that Mr. Duren's mentioned that's it's worth comparing the two so that folks understand. The Ernebuck program that they had initially, we actually, unfortunately, that bad outcome happened in Wisconsin, but we learned from that. And whenever we developed our Ernebuck program, we didn't make it so that all the antler deer in a bag limit had to be earned. In other words, hunters started out with 2, and then if they desired to harvest more antler deer, they had to earn them. And that was through harvesting antlerless deer and providing those for sampling in unit CWD. So that's one significant difference between their Ernebuck that they had and the one we currently have. Another thing is Mr. Durham spoke of kiosk, and he may have to clean this up a little bit, but that's the equivalent of our sampling stations, where hunters these are located conveniently for hunters in the affected counties to take their deer heads by and drop those off, and they're eventually sampled, and then those hunters get those results. So just know that's what he's referring to. And lastly, he spoke of a dumpster program. We've got a disposal issue in the affected area. We ideally deer carcasses from that area would either be or the parts that aren't being utilized by hunters would be disposed of through incineration, which just isn't available in that area. Secondarily, the best choice would be landfills, but unfortunately, the landfills will not accept deer from those areas unless there's proof that they were not detected for CWD, and time doesn't allow for that before deer need to be disposed of. So, without the landfills being an option, we don't have the dumpster program, and that's why we have the carcass management site instead. So just be aware of that. And then lastly, I wanted to mention that the program that Steph was talking about outside of deer season, where we're partnering with landowners and with their permission harvesting some additional deer on those properties, that's really focused. She described it as sparks, which is completely accurate. But I wanted to emphasize that that's on the outer fringe of the disease. That's where the greatest threat, or the greatest chance to stop the spread of the disease. And just want to remind everyone just how important it is to keep it out of an area. And that's the best way, in addition to hunter harvest, that we can protect the rest of the state from CWD. And the deer that are harvested that way will be processed and utilized if they're not detected for CWD. And then we're going to make sure those deer are disposed of in a responsible way. So just wanted to follow up with that.
Dan, Doug brought up a good point that concerns me as I own a farm in Clay County. And what concerns me is not only does this affect the deer, it can affect the land. How can it affect the land, and how long does it affect the land? And can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what you're talking about is the environmental persistence of the prion. I mean, just to get down to it, the infectious agent that causes chronic wasting disease. You know, at this point in time, you know, a lot of the work that's been done has been done with captive animals, where basically, you know, you have a pen that's had research animals in it that had CWD, and all you have to do is throw an animal into there, even if there's no animals in there, and they get it just by being in the pen. You know, and we know that the prions are nearly indestructible in the environment. And actually what ends up happening is they don't make it down through the water table. A lot of people think it's just percolating down and it's going to end up in the water table. It actually binds pretty quickly to the top layer of soil. And so it's actually, the prions are actually there in that top layer of soil for a long period. So, you know, when you get into these, where you have deer either naturally congregating or, you know, artificially congregating, if you're putting out salt blocks or those kind of things, those are areas where those prions are going to be highly concentrated. And every time an animal comes to it, they are then exposed, because those prions don't break down in the environment. You know, the natural degradation does not occur in the environment. You know, basically we know there's two ways to destroy a prion, and it's not natural. Incineration, as Chuck mentioned, but the incineration needs to reach over 1,000 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Most forest fires don't burn at that heat. You know, a good forest fire, you know, if you're talking about doing burn management or things like that, will not reach that and achieve that to destroy that prion. The other way is through chemical denaturing. And so that's through usually high concentrations of things like chlorine, bleach, and there's a bunch of other not commercially available necessarily chemicals. I shouldn't say commercially available. I mean, available to the general public. You know, there's things that we use in the labs and things like that we can actually use to destroy the prions, but it's not something you can go and apply to the landscape. And so, you know, one of the critical areas where we actually need research in general is this environmental component. And there's a lot of groups working nationally to try and develop research programs surrounding this environmental component. Because right now, the only thing we have is control methods for our deer, but we need control methods for the environment also, and they're just not available to us right now. So, you know, if you look at it right now, you draw the 10-mile buffer around all of our positives, you know, we're looking at over 4,500 square miles, you know, spread out across 7 counties at this point in time. You know, that's a big area to try and worry about the environmental component of the disease. You know, and so to kind of roll it back in, those areas kind of in the central area on the Fayette Hardeman County line, where we've got those, you know, high prevalences and high numbers of positive animals, those areas are going to have a higher environmental burden of prion just because there's that many more animals in that area. And it's less and less of a burden in the environment as you get further out, because the prevalences are much lower and there's a lot less animals in a given area that might have the disease. So there's less chance in those low prevalence areas of the environment playing a role, you know, unless it's at an area like a natural congregation area, like a salt, you know, like a natural salt area or a rub site or a scrape or those kind of areas where bucks are frequenting. But in general, the environment in the beginning of a transmission cycle isn't playing as much of a role as it is once the prevalences reach, 20, 30%, because then there is that environmental burden. So early on, it actually requires that deer-to-deer contact. And so when you have low prevalences of disease, that's why you focus so much effort, kind of like with the targeted removal program, in those low prevalence areas, because you can still impact the disease by removing diseased animals, because those individual animals make more of a difference. Whereas, you have your higher prevalence areas, you got to do both. You got to kind of work on the environment as well as keeping the number of positive animals on the landscape at a lower number.
Hey, Doug, up in Wisconsin, knowing that you guys are getting close or have reached the 50% threshold, have you seen a loss of, number one, have you seen loss of hunter numbers? Or, and then have you seen a decrease in land prices or lease prices on the land due to CWD being found there?
There's been discussion of both of those things. I have not personally seen it. I do know that land prices have held pretty steadily. The leases in Richland County, where I am, has not been something there's been a lot of in the past. It's actually becoming more popular, and I don't know, relative to the market, if there's been an increase or a decrease. So, there's that. And can I go back to one thing? And that was when you mentioned Ernebuck. You folks are doing it in a way that I wish that we could go to in Wisconsin, if we could go back, but then also going forward, what we'd like to do. And really, I'm calling it like a bonus buck program, that we'd like to be able to go, if you have a buck tag and you take that buck, and people that I've spoken to, and I do a lot of asking questions because I'm on the County Deer Advisory Council and involved with some other work, ask a lot of questions of folks about, what do you think about this idea? People who didn't like Ernebuck, that you had to shoot a doe before you shoot a buck, were perfectly okay with the bonus buck idea. Especially my bow hunting friends who had that one bow tag and would love to have that opportunity for the second one. And that cutting the head off and putting it into, in our case, the kiosks or your collection sites, and sorry, our terms are a little bit different, but putting in that collection site, now we have a paper trail, right? I mean, you have a head, you have a paper trail, and that person then has that buck tag. I hope that we can go to that. So I want to applaud you folks for, learning from that with us and moving forward in that way. Hunter numbers, we've seen a decline in hunting, and I think some of that can be attributed to chronic wasting disease, but we've seen an overall decline in hunting numbers. And I've hunted this area for a long time, since I was a kid, with a few years of not being here, but since I was a kid, and it's just the changes in land ownership has something to do with it. The changes in attitude about how you hunt deer. We used to do a lot of deer drives when I was younger. Not a whole lot of that goes on anymore. There's a lot more sitting and waiting and fear of maybe running that deer off, the big buck off your property or something like that. And so I think those changes, I just experienced opening weekend here in Wisconsin, and opening day was sort of like most opening days. You hear a lot of shooting. The second day, a lot less, and today it was real quiet. So our hunting pressure isn't the same, but to attribute all that to CWD, I don't necessarily would be fair.
Dan, number one, what counties are in the affected zones? If you could answer that real fast.
In terms of the positive counties and the high-risk counties, is that what you're asking?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, the positive counties at this point in time are Fayette and Hardeman, Shelby, Tipton, Haywood, Madison, and Chester counties. And the McNairy, Lauderdale, Crockett, and Gibson counties are considered our high-risk counties, for a total of 11 counties in the what we're calling the CWD affected area. One thing when Mr. Durham was talking, that it reminded me of, and we don't talk about it as much when we're talking about things now, because we're talking about the earn a buck and things, but we started in the beginning to institute a replacement buck program where if you harvest a positive buck, you can go out and harvest another buck automatically just because that animal is positive. And you actually get to keep your trophy out of that animal too. So, as long as you meet the requirements, if you're traveling out of the county for movement restrictions with material that can move out of the county, you can still go out and harvest another animal in the area. So that's another added program. I'm not sure how many people actually are utilizing that, but we do have a lot of bucks that are harvested that are positive. And that's an unlimited, like basically if you got into an area with a lot of positive bucks, you could just keep harvesting bucks in that area. So.
And a follow up to that, Dan, is exactly how many bucks were harvested or deer were harvested in the CWD zone, say last year, and how many of those animals tested positive for CWD, correct?
Yeah, I mean, those numbers are available. Do I have them off the top of my head? Not necessarily. I can tell you we had 678 positives before the start of the season when you combined the 2018-19 season and the 2019-20 season. We're up to, as of this morning, 84 positives that we received results back on. The majority of those are from Fayette and Hardeman. We have not expanded into new counties, but we do have additional positives in those other counties that I mentioned. So every county that had positives last year still has positives this year. We're seeing it kind of in the same distribution. And we've gotten test results from those impacted counties. I think we're sitting right around 2,000 test results back. But we just sent a huge slug of samples last week that were still about 2,000, I think, is what I heard that were sent last week that we're waiting on results on, as well as, the ones from this last weekend. There's going to be another big slug from this weekend. And typically Thanksgiving weekend, we actually end up with a lot of samples out of because everybody's kind of home and for the holidays kind of thing. And we're actually anticipating potentially having more animals harvested this year as a result of COVID. And, just more people worried about food security and things like that. So there was actually increased numbers of license sales and turkeys harvested in the spring when we were kind of anticipating that might also occur with deer this year.
So I guess the question I had and that we got on Facebook was, well, if there's only 84 deer that have tested positive, is it really that big of a problem? But
that's so far this year,
right? And that doesn't mean there's only 84 deer on the landscape that had CWD. You guys go the next step and extrapolate that out over the herd, correct?
Yeah, I mean that's when you talk about prevalence, And so when you're talking about prevalence, a better way to look at prevalence. So when we say there's 10% prevalence. If I went out and randomly selected 100 deer and tested them off the landscape, that means 10 of those deer are going to be positive. And so you can extrapolate out and, based on what you think rough estimates of deer densities in a given area are. And we can tell you roughly, based on this prevalence level, this is how many deer are on the landscape that are positive. Because remember, every year, not every deer is harvested either. And so, we've got areas, unfortunately, we'll have better data this year because we've changed the way we're collecting our data, but we only had county-wide surveillance data. We didn't have the finer scale for our non-detect locations in previous years, so we just could only report at the county level. But we do know there's areas within certain counties, specifically Fayette and Hardeman, where the prevalences are well over 30 and 40% already. In some places are even reporting 60% of the harvested animals on their property in terms of adult bucks tested positive. And so we know those areas exist within our state already. And we do know that between the 2018-19 season and the 2019-20 season, we actually had a significant increase in the prevalence at a countywide level in Fayette and Hardeman counties. Now, to be able to measure that, a significant change from one year to another, granted it was only 1 percentage point, but if you're talking about 100,000 deer, that's 1,000 extra deer on the landscape that are now positive. And so there's portions of the counties that are, Fayette and Hardeman, they're already in that, what we talk about being an exponential growth curve, like that fast growth curve, where we'll start to see potentially over the course of the next 3 to 4 years, a 4 or 5% increase potentially, in certain areas with 4 or 5% increase in prevalence in certain areas. And so that's just the nature of the disease, where it kind of plugs along for a long period at lower prevalences, but then all of a sudden it skyrockets because you reach that prevalence point where you're starting to get more and more of your fawns positive. And so, fawns and does and everything else. And so you just end up with more positive animals on the landscape. And it's kind of hard to predict the patterns of spread with CWD because it ends up going basically in family units after a certain point in time. Bucks spread at far distances, but within a given area, you may have just one family unit impacted and the family unit directly adjacent, because they don't ever interact, never ends up positive. And so it's a weird disease in that way.
Well, we at the TWRA wanted to have this conversation so we could get the truth out there and get the facts and the science out to people in Tennessee. And like I said, we've had a lot of questions online regarding some of the things that we've done. And I've been through a couple of them today. Another was, tell us the true reason behind killing all of the deer herd that we've worked so hard to achieve over these years. Some of the other questions were more black helicopter type conspiracy theories, a whole group of politicians, this is their way of taking away our guns. And it's the agricultural industry, trying to kill the deer off so they don't eat all the corn. And or the insurance lobby. That's the way they save money, because the deer won't be jumping out in front of our cars any longer. One of the final conspiracy theories that we got on Facebook was that this new CWD had occurred, and the federal government was paying the state of Tennessee for every positive CWD case. Is that true? It kind of leads into the new coronavirus conspiracy theory about numbers going up, so every hospital gets more money. The same argument has been made about CWD. For every positive case that we find, we get more money. Can you explain funding for CWD and all of that?
Well, in all honesty, there has not been federal dollars available specifically for CWD since 2010, when the federal surveillance program stopped, and that money was taken away. And so the money, and I'll let TWRA speak to this if I misstep on this, but the money that is allocated for CWD is basically part of the normal operating budget of TWRA through Pittman-Roberts money, which is a federal program, but we don't get more money because we have more positives. That's actually based on license sales in your state, is the way that program kind of runs, and what percentage of hunters to license sales and things like that you have, which is a way more complicated. That's you got to talk to some accountants to get into the nitty-gritty details of it. But conservation is still funded through license sales from the user groups that use the resource, as well as from the items that they purchase to participate in hunting, fishing, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's excise taxes and things like that on hunting gear and fishing and things like that. But that program, that Pittman-Roberts program for wildlife conservation, and the Dingell-Johnson program for fisheries, those have been programs for over 80 years. And so those programs are basically what's funding conservation and CWD, surveillance and everything else, for basically the last 8 decades. That's how wildlife conservation has pretty much been funded. In terms of, people say we want to kill off all the deer, and the reality is what we're giving people is management tools. 95% of the land that's in our impacted area is privately owned. And when people ask us, what can we do about CWD? These are the management tools that we currently have available to us. As we develop new management tools through research, which takes a long time, unfortunately, with CWD. Research isn't just, we have an answer the next day. If this isn't COVID, there's not billions of dollars being dumped into trying to solve this problem. We would love it if there was, because we might actually have some better solutions. But we can only use the suite of tools that we have available to us based on the current available literature and science and experiences from other states. One of the things we didn't talk about was in Illinois, just south of the border from where they were doing all that work in Wisconsin, they continued. And their prevalences never really climbed much. And their disease, it did spread eventually across the state, but the prevalences are extremely low. I mean, we're talking less than 5% in most areas. And I think the highest area they have it is 15%. And they've had the disease just as long as Wisconsin, but they've done different management actions. So we're not talking about getting rid of the disease. We want to keep it from spreading out of given areas and keep the prevalence low so we have a healthy deer population. We don't want it to get to those prevalences where we don't have a healthy age structure. We don't want to get it to where our fawns aren't surviving to where they can reproduce. That's what that means. Doug mentioned it earlier. If you're infected as a fawn, meaning you either got it, while you were in the womb, before you were born, or you got it shortly thereafter from your mom, you're not going to live to put another deer on the landscape if you're a doe. And if you're a buck, you're not going to live long enough to actually breed. And so that's when you start seeing these impacts on the population. So we're trying to prevent that from happening. And the best tools we have are to keep deer that are sick or infected with the disease currently from interacting with deer that are not infected. That's the whole goal of that. And the way to do that is to decrease numbers, because there's less likelihood that they're going to interact with other animals outside of their given home range.
So, yeah, go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I can't help myself at speaking to conspiracies. They're just so intriguing to me, and they're just fun at times. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about those. And one is the notion that we're trying to kill all the deer or eradicate the deer. That's not the case at all. Our intent is to protect the deer resource and have as healthy of deer population as we can have, even in the affected area. And now, in the case of a CWD area, that means, unfortunately, that you need to lower the deer population, and you need to manage against older bucks in order to keep prevalence from increasing. So, but unfortunately, that gets spun at times into they're trying to kill all the deer, and that's just not the case at all. In regards to federal funding, I wish there were substantial federal funding for CWD. There's not even close. And as Dan described, we're using state license dollars to fund the service testing that we're doing for hunters, and to fund all the management that we're doing, and some of that is eligible for federal aid, but not near enough, and it's a big misconception to think that we are trying to find more CWD in order to be eligible for more federal funding. Even if that were a possibility, we would not do that, and then again, the funding is just not there to begin with. And then the last one about the CWD in Tennessee being a conspiracy to somehow jeopardize gun rights. Well, that's not the case at all. And I think if you listen close, we're talking about harvesting more deer, which, as Mr. Duran pointed out earlier, that is through guns. That's the most efficient way to harvest deer, through hunting, and that's so we're encouraging the use of guns and the harvest of deer, and we'd be thrilled with more gun sales to harvest more deer, and that does create some more funding through those excise taxes that go along with the sale of firearms. So anyway, there's my contributions to the conspiracy talk.
So Dan, you were talking about the tools that we were using, and in layman's terms, what I took from you was we're enacting these tools so we can keep this disease at bay until the science can catch up, till we can find a way to find a vaccine or some therapeutic cure for this illness. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, not necessarily until there's a therapeutic treatment, because let's be honest, we're talking wildlife. There wouldn't be any way to administer at any level if there was a therapy to stop the disease. What we're talking about is the environmental solutions that I mentioned earlier, environmental treatments that we can get rid of it in the environment. Basically you're trying to balance a healthy population of deer with and there might be a certain number of them that actually are still diseased on the landscape. And so what you're trying to do is find that balance. And that's kind of where more agencies have started to shift towards, because there's this environmental persistence that we weren't really aware of in the beginning. There was some anecdotal evidence, and in the beginning, I'm talking about it in the 90s and in the early 2000s, when a lot of the work was just starting on some of these things. And now we know that there's this environmental persistence. So what we are trying to do, like you said, is buy some time and keep the prevalences and keep it from where it's spreading even further at a manageable level, so that if we do have some of these tools that are developed for environmental mitigation or things like that, we have a suite of tools that we can provide a landowner. And unfortunately, that suite of tools right now, one thing we've all done well, between the agency and researchers and land managers being the individual property owners, we know how to grow deer. We know how to create habitat. We know how to put more deer on the landscape. The problem is the landscape is infected at a certain point, for lack of a better term, just so that everybody kind of understands what we're getting at. And so we can manage the best we can, but if you're still getting sick just by walking outside, or, think about that for a minute. If you can walk outside and you're just getting sick from being in the environment that you're in, it's kind of self-defeating. And so really what we're trying to do is keep that at a minimal amount until we have some of these other solutions where we can start going at some of these environmental solutions.
Stephanie, the best way for you to know what's going on in Tennessee is to have the data, right?
That's definitely true. We currently have a robust surveillance system across the state so that we can detect any infection across the state. And so we have targets to reach every year so that we can detect the disease across the state, not just within Unit CWD. And so I think that's really critical, so that everyone in Tennessee understands that we are looking for the disease in other areas, in addition to managing the disease in Unit CWD.
And what incentives or rules have we put in place to make hunters want to get their animals tested? I had one tested on Saturday here in Gallatin, and it's not even in the CWD zone, but I know our guys are out there doing it.
That's great. Yeah. So testing is free statewide, and there are in Unit CWD where it's very easy to get it tested. We have drop-off locations, and you can take it to any taxidermist and processor. We also have check stations throughout the state, and testing is free. We've really compressed our notification times in the last 2 years, and so it's available, it's very convenient, and it's relatively really pretty quick.
Doug, what's the DNR up there doing to incentivize hunters to get their deer tested, or is it a rule?
Well, making it available is the number one thing. Any hunter who wants to get their deer tested in this state can. And one of the things that we have found is that the easier you make it, the more apt people are to do it. And so these drop-off locations, these kiosks are an example, and that's involving folks like myself who are volunteering to help with that. So that's one of the things. We don't have a bonus buck program, which would be a great thing. One thing we do have is to get your deer, you get your deer tested, and if it's whatever tag it is that you use, if it's a buck and it tests positive, you get a replacement tag for it. We've proposed through our County Deer Advisory Council that any deer that tests positive would then result in any deer replacement tag. So if you shot a doe and it tested positive, that you could also you would then get any deer tag, so you can shoot a buck with that if you wanted to. But a lot of our incentives were honestly taken away. Expanded seasons. We're back to a 9-day gun season where we had an earlier gun season in the management area. We have a 4-day antlerless only season in mid-December, and then we have a holiday hunt that's antlerless only for gun hunters also. And one of the things that we've done for our bow hunters is that we've extended. We have the tool, and if our County Deer Advisory Council uses it, to extend the bow season to the end of January if we'd like. So the incentives aren't there, but I will say this: as prevalence has grown and the disease has spread, it's been a lot of individual groups, the Deer Association type groups, local sportsmen or sports people clubs, who've been doing things to incentivize people to get their deer tested and dispose of them properly. So it's been important, I think, in our case, that folks like me have gotten involved and that hunters have gotten involved. If I could speak about one other thing, I've been watching some of the comments on Facebook, and Dan spoke about this, very well. It really is a reduction in risk. There isn't a silver bullet, looming on the outskirts, just like, COVID. There are things that we can do to reduce our risk. So let's use those tools as much as we can. One person said something about what I'm hearing people are cutting the heads off of does along the highway and turning them in, and they're getting a buck tag or, for that. And my response is, so what? No, I don't like cheaters either. That stinks that they're doing that, but they are getting that tag. They are turning that head in. That head is being tested, and they are getting that tag to be able to take another deer. So maybe not the perfect scenario, but that's working. Another question that somebody had was, well, what about the salt blocks that I put up for my horses on the farm? I've had the same thing. I do grass-fed beef, and so I have beef out on pasture. What I've done is I don't have salt or mineral out on pasture anymore. I have them at a closer location to the buildings. In fact, it makes my animals come back to the building every day, and they do that. It was a fairly simple thing to do. And locations out in the pasture that I had where we had a salt lick or a mineral lick for the cattle, I've gone out there and with the skid steer and just dug it up and buried it. And it's not a place where deer are returning to. So yeah, none of these things are perfect, as is almost everything in life, right? Things aren't perfect, but we can do things, and by implementing all these various opportunities and these various management practices, we're slowing, buying time. And the second part of that is paying for science. We have to pay for science. We do need more federal money. We do need more state money. We need that Pittman-Robertson money. And that's our best hope for it. Letting this rip is not effective, and I can tell you that's not effective in Wisconsin. So I just did want to address them because I've been watching these folks talking about them on Facebook here.
Chuck, in Tennessee, you grow up and whoever you're hunting with, be it your dad or your grandfather or whatever, or maybe your friend. You go out hunting, you like to get the biggest animal you could possibly get. So, I like to say we hunt mature deer. Some people say it's trophy hunting, but really what you're looking for is a mature animal. And when it comes to CWD, what animal, is it a young buck or is it an old buck? Which one of those animals is the one spreading this disease? Who is the spark?
Well, our data is showing us that the older age class bucks have the highest incidence of having CWD. And then, but we are in the high prevalence areas are seeing a significant amount of does and even fawns, which we've talked about that, but hadn't really emphasized why that's so problematic. But whenever you see it in fawns, that's just an indication that you've got high prevalence, because that's just what you have. So anyway, but yeah, you in a CWD area, you kind of have to rethink the way or the value that you've put on different animals in the past. And there should be less emphasis on older age class deer and more emphasis on overall population health. And I'm very interested in folks continuing to harvest mature deer. In fact, I hope they harvest every mature deer they get a chance to, because that would be helpful for CWD management. But also, it's just maybe more focus on the food quality of the animal, and that would make folks more interested in harvesting more deer and antlerless deer. And as long as they have those tested as we recommend, and they come back not detected, then that's a measure that's available to help people be comfortable about consuming those deer. So anyway, you really do have to rethink your priorities and values at a long time, or that are based on a lot of tradition. But I've experienced that myself, and it's necessary and really important for the health of the deer population.
Doug, I watch Meat Eater just like a lot of us do. You guys had this same conversation about age class of deer and what you needed to take off your farm. Can you explain what you were talking about there?
Yeah, if you've watched our Meat Eater episodes, some of them are coming back out now on YouTube. And one of the first ones that I did, which was, 6 or 7 years ago now, CWD I was in the management zone. And in fact, we were doing a management hunt on that first episode, and I shot a little 1.5-year-old buck, and Steve wore the sombrero for me, because that was if you shot a little buck, the deal was you had to wear the sombrero. And he said, well, you should, if I get to eat some of it, you give me some of that meat, I'll wear the sombrero for you. Well, we ended that practice. We did buck management, but we were, it was pretty loose. I mean, it was encouraging people to let some younger bucks go and have some bigger bucks. But if you go to the Meat Eater website, there are a couple of articles that I wrote about CWD and my experience with it. And one of them is why I retired the sombrero. Because I call myself a conservationist, one of the reasons I retired it was because of chronic wasting disease. Anecdotally, and Dan or Stephanie or any of you folks could address this a little bit more, being on the edge of it, we've had the deer that we've had test positive have generally been younger deer, and they have I'm speculating that these are younger deer that have moved from the higher population areas south of us. We've been killing a lot of deer on our place and in our area for a long time, because of my conservation ideas on oak regeneration, which the deer love white oak acorns and red oak seedlings, so that having a lot of deer doesn't make for regenerating oak. So we were doing a lot of that. And the other thing that we found, quite frankly, is when we knocked our population of antlerless deer back, we had more bucks and we had bigger bucks. But what we ended up finding when we started getting positives 3 years ago is that our deer the positives have been younger. So I took off any restrictions and said, for not just for CWD, but for other reasons too, because I got tired of managing that whole thing. I just want people to come and enjoy hunting. And I haven't liked the trend, and I didn't want to be a part of anymore of that focus on just trophy management, because meat eating is a big part of why we're hunting. Don't get me wrong, I like harvesting big bucks too, but anyway, I didn't want to do that kind of management. So our rule has now become, You take a good ethical shot and any deer that you like, and we will all celebrate it with you. And part of that was because I was seeing this anecdotal evidence, and again, the biologists can talk about this, about it seemed like the old deer on our farm, or were our deer, I don't know, maybe they're like me, right? I'm older now and I don't move around as much. I'm not going out looking around, doing anything like that, you know, traveling as much, like dating and things like that. I'm sticking close to home. My wife appreciates that. And it seems like our local deer, where we don't have a high, because I'm in an area that doesn't have a high prevalence yet, our older deer didn't have the disease. These have been younger deer mostly that we've had, and the oldest ones have been 3.5-year-olds. One of our positives last year was a 1.5-year-old doe. Brian Richards from USGS Wildlife Health Center, he said, well, that's interesting anecdotal evidence, but don't read too much into that, Doug. It's you know, here I'm this guy out here listening to all these smart folks talk about it, and then I'm trying to apply it in my area and talk to folks about it. So those are some of the experiences we're having. It's just really interesting how I had a fella say to me the other day, boy, you know, we had 3 out of 5 deer test positive last year. This is getting scary. And my response was, getting scary? 3 out of 5 is very scary when you start to think about how that can be. You know, let's not, oh, geez, we have it around here now. Let's start doing something about it. No, if you've got those kind of numbers, you already got trouble. So now you're into that mitigation mode, that management mode. So I would encourage folks in Tennessee to be thinking about that. If you don't have it, you don't want it. And if you have it, you want as little as possible, and support the agency and this great work that you guys are doing there.
So,
you know,
Chuck,
one of the things, if I can chime in here.
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, Chuck mentioned we've seen it in a higher number in our adult bucks. And that's kind of the pattern that most states find it when they first find it. And the reality is because adult bucks have interacted with more deer in the landscape than like a doe has or a younger buck. But once it's in a family unit, you know, like if you have bucks that are dispersing from a family unit, you know, that young buck that's being kicked out of the family unit kind of deal, they actually disperse further. And so whenever you start getting it into the doe family unit structure, anything that comes out of there is likely to be positive. And those yearling bucks, we know the yearling buck class, they have a further dispersal. As Mr. Duran mentioned, you know, adult bucks have actually a very discrete home range. They're not wandering around as much anymore because they've established a home range in their given area. But they still interact with more animals within their home range than maybe that doe family unit does. So those yearling bucks, when you start finding it in those yearling bucks at a high number, you're having a high number of animals dispersing from a known endemic area is kind of what that starts to indicate, you know, as well as it's in those family units within that given area. Because if you're 18 months old and you're already positive, well, you came in contact with the disease at a pretty early age in your life. And so, you know, you're not likely to see the next year anyways, but you've already dispersed out to another area and potentially spread that disease to that other area. You know, that also brings up a good point of, you know, and another thing that Mr. Durham mentioned was if you got 3 out of 5, that disease has been there for a while. You know, when you find your first positive in a given area, the disease has already been there for a while when you find it, because I think there's only one place where anybody can ever say that they found the very first one, they got rid of it, and they never found it again. You know, you see this pattern of you keep going back to that same area year after year after year, and you start finding more and more positives. And that's kind of the concept behind targeted removal is you find that first positive, there's going to be more positives in that area, and you want to try and get the rest of the family unit and be mindful in what you're removing in a very discrete area around where you found that positive. And that's kind of, you know, when you start gearing some of these removal programs, you're looking at a doe that might have been positive. You know, if you have a yearling buck, you know, it's hard to say that was his home range, right? But if you have a doe that was positive in your periphery, you know there's other animals of her family unit that were positive. And so that's the logic behind it, is if you can go in and snuff out that family unit, and I know people hate hearing that kind of terminology, but if you can get that focal family unit before it starts interacting with all the other family units around it, or causing an overburden in the environment of prions, that's your best bet for keeping prevalences low in the periphery, as well as keeping it from spreading further at that point in the periphery.
Well, we're gonna wrap this up, but I think each of us should have, a last thought about what we wanted to say. And I think I've heard this in another conversation on this CWD, I guess, but my thought would be, why should people care about CWD, especially if they're not hunters? But what we do at TWRA is we don't only take care of deer and turkeys and bass. We also take care of all non-game species. Every animal in the state we take care of, whether it's an amphibian or a crawfish or anything like that. And a lot of the money that goes toward taking care of all of these animals comes from the sale of licenses for hunting. So we have one license in the state of Tennessee, and it's a hunting and fishing license. So, when you buy that, you're supporting the conservation of all the animals, and not just deer and turkeys and fish. So I think it's important in that. And, there are all, of course, there are other reasons, but deer hunting is important to the rest of the animals in the state, because deer hunting, sells licenses. And so on top of that, there is a small chance, be it small, that this disease or whatever could pass from a deer to a human. We haven't been able to prove that yet or see that, but nobody wants that to happen. So I care about that. I care because this disease has been documented to cause a population impact on deer herds elsewhere in the United States. So I absolutely care about that. And I don't want this to spread anywhere that I hunt, because, I would think twice about allowing my child to eat one of these deer that might test positive for CWD. So I want to control the spread of CWD, absolutely. So I don't have to make that decision. I don't want to have to do that. So it's incredibly important to me that we have you guys doing the science, and that we need to follow the science in this case and do what you guys tell us to do. And if that is take more animals off the landscape, I think we need to take more animals off the landscape. I'm not a scientist. I'm a lawyer by trade. I can't do science. So I trust you guys. So I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad we have people talking to us like Doug Duren, and because this is important. So thank you. Chuck, do you have something to say?
Yeah, I've got a few things. I'm known for always having something to say, so I was a safe bet. But yeah, I'd like to especially thank Mr. Duren for joining us. This isn't the first time he's helped us, and he does a fantastic job without really needing any assistance. So I appreciate him, and I thanks to the communication staff that are supporting this, the ones that are on the screen and the ones that are behind the scenes. They do a great job, and doing a meeting this way is challenging, but it's so convenient and helpful, and I'm just grateful that we're able to have another public meeting like this. And thanks to the viewers who have watched this and are passionate enough to care and learn, and appreciate their participation. I want to encourage hunters to keep doing the good work that they're doing and in protecting this a valuable resource, whether they're outside of the CWD zone and they don't have to worry about this so much. And, you know, they're doing their part to harvest responsibly and protect the resource and fund conservation. And that's so important. And for those hunters and other stakeholders that are in the unit CWD or the CWD affected area, special thanks to them. You know, we're seeing really good results from deer season thus far. We had kind of a setback the first full season after we discovered the disease, and we just need more harvest from hunters. And we know that hunters are the only ones that can harvest at the level that is needed, and they're being responsive to the harvest and sampling, which does so much to help better inform our management. So appreciate their partnership, and want to mention the Harvest Incentive Program that got so much attention over the last month. I'm excited about it. A lot of people are excited about the opportunity to earn free licenses through additional harvest in Unit CWD. So grateful for that new program and excited to see the results of that. Thank you.
Dan, do you have anything you want to say?
No, I mean, I think everybody, we echo the same sentiments that everyone echoes when we have our final word about CWD. And the one thing I always say is for us as wildlife managers, and me specifically as a wildlife health professional, to do nothing when the science tells us there are things we can do would be irresponsible. And so we make recommendations based on what the science that we currently have is telling us that we can do at this point in time. And we strive to learn more and alter our recommendations if new information becomes available. And so that's kind of what our goal is. We're talking about CWD here, but that's general philosophy for any wildlife management, as well as any wildlife health manager that I'm aware of, is, you know, you use the best science that you currently have available, and you strive to learn more as time goes on, and you change things. And so if we start to change recommendations as we learn more information here in the state of Tennessee, it's because the science and the data are telling us we need to change things and modify things. And it's not because we're being wishy-washy, you know, which we get accused of a lot of times. It's no, you know, there's a lot of states that have been dealing with this, and they've been doing some long-term research projects. And as that information gets vetted and verified, we learn things. And so, all right, well, we need to change. You know, and so that's we're just hoping that people are flexible with us as we go through this process and learn more about the disease here in our state and learn better ways to manage the disease in general.
All right, Stephanie, thanks for joining us. Do you want to comment?
Just real quick, I'll say this is a long-term disease. The management of it is with us for the long haul. We need to be prepared to work as partners with hunters, with landowners, with land managers to manage this disease in the long run. So we need to work together. It's not a short-term disease. So thanks, Mr. Durham, for your input. The boots on the ground and the personal experience really does matter. And it's good to hear your perspective. So thank you very much.
Doug, thank you for joining us. Ended up here with some words of wisdom. I like your, you know, it's not ours, it's just our turn, but tell us about it.
Well, that's really it, isn't it? I mean, that's what conservation is. It just isn't about us. This is about the future. Clearly, the present's important, but the future is really important. And I just listening to Dan and Stephanie and this idea of adaptive management. The science changes, the management changes, and of course it should. Bob Dylan said it used to go like that, now it goes like this. Well, he was talking about music, but that's how science, that's what science does to us too. It's not being wishy-washy, it's not being a flip-flopper, you know. And I hear sometimes, and I resent this so much, and it's very upsetting to me that, you know, people like Dan and Stephanie and other scientists will get attacked as if somehow they are folks who are, you know, that they've got an agenda that we don't know. These people are spending their lives, they devoted their lives to this, their professional lives, their personal lives, they care about it. So I find that to be really upsetting. I have a lot of friends in the science community, and I know the hard work that they put into this. I want to thank you guys so much for that work. And, you know, we need to respect science. We need to respect nature, and we need to respect each other. And yeah, we do need to remember that it's not just ours. It's our, you know, it's, I'm sorry, it's not ours. It's just our turn. I think I'd remember that. But I'm a little emotional here because I really do. Every time I get to hear these good scientists talking about this stuff and feeling like I want to be at their side and I want to defend them. And if I have a message for my fellow hunters and folks that are involved, is support these folks in the work they're doing. They're doing it for you and they're doing it for the future. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Doug. That's perfect. Just like Doug said, let's look to the science. Let's get engaged. Let us know your thoughts. Let's promote research on CWD. You know, whatever way you can do that. Get out there and get your deer tested. That's the simplest way. And we may not be able to individually stop CWD, but we all can help the research to get it stopped. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time tonight and joining us. Jason, do you have anything else?
Yeah, Mike, I just want to say thank you to everybody that's been tuning in and watching and commenting. And I see a lot of people are thankful and grateful that we're having this discussion, and they're helping us out. They're out there harvesting deer and trying to do their part. So I just thank the hunter, thank the sportsmen and women of Tennessee. And just remember CWDintennessee.com for all the up-to-date information on CWD in Tennessee. tnwildlife.org to find the hunting guide, page 29, information on CWD and the hunting guide, and so on. Know your seasons, know your bag limits, know your incentives. And Doug, thank you for being with us. And until next time, get outside, go outdoors. Outdoors is wide open. So we'll see y'all next time.